Hello and welcome. Difficult times for all of us, a real crisis. But I'd like to again start the show with a round of applause for all our frontline workers, our frontline Jawans, the medical, the people on essential duties, the police, everyone. Please join me in clapping for them. They're risking their lives for us. There are times when you wonder, how much do you know about a virus? And this is a brand new virus and we know so little. We're learning every single day something new. But more than that, how much do we know about the economy in a crisis like this? This is about the worst crisis we've had in decades. And how should one respond? How should one respond to the lockdown? Well, I can't tell you, I'm so lucky to have one of the most brilliant minds on what to do in a crisis like this. And that is Professor Raghuram Rajan. Raghuram Rajan was one of the few people globally that forecast the first crisis in 2008-2009. He saw it ahead of time and everybody said, no, I don't think you're right, etc. But he stuck to it and he was right and much respected after that. Then, of course, he became governor of our RBI, one of the finest governors we've ever had. And proof of that, many countries want him to give up being governor of the RBI and be governor of their country, their Reserve Bank or their Federal Reserve, whatever it is around the world. So, just want to say how grateful I am, and Raghuram Rajan, thank you very much for joining us. I think what we first want to know is how big is this crisis? Are people exaggerating it? Are we underestimating it? And what should India be worried about? And how seriously should we take it? Really from the economic point of view.
Well, if the virus spreads as it has spread in Italy and the United States, we have to take it very seriously. What you see in those countries is a tremendous effect on public health, a overburdening of the hospitals, many deaths. And of course, when that is happening, economic activity is hard to carry on economic activity. So if we want to avoid that, we have to bring down the curve of infections in India. The good news, at least from the numbers that we see, is that we've had early warning. What we have to do is make full use of the warning we've had. The fact that it first went to China, then the West, and now is coming to the emerging markets like India. We need to make sure that we are well prepared because we start with fewer resources than the West.
I would absolutely agree with you there. There's a lot of antagonism towards China, most of it really base and unfair. But as you said, we are lucky that we had early warning. They had it much before us. We saw what they did wrong, what they did right, and we got it later and we managed to learn from that and do something. But first, let's say first focus is to stop the spread in India. And then given the projections, how bad do you think it's going to be here in India?
Well, almost surely a deep recession this year. We're already seeing evidence of it from the shuttering of plants as we see a lockdown. China in the first quarter experienced a fall of something like 35% of GDP annualized. They are bringing their plants back on track. Coal consumption in China is now 95% of normal. But still, there are many sectors that are not back to normal. For example, Starbucks says it's operating at about 50% of its normal capacity. And that's understandable. Few people want to go into a crowded restaurant or cafe today. So what this means for industrial countries is that growth will move from what was a moderate 2.5% growth rate in the US, 1.5% in Europe, to probably negative 4 or 5 in both areas, despite a huge stimulus of between 10 and 20 percentage points of GDP. So this is after stimulus growth this year is going to be really low. Hopefully we see a rebound next year. A lot depends on the measures we take to prevent a recurrence.
Right, and the global impact on India will be obviously very significant. If we look at the forecasts that are currently doing the rounds, that Europe and America, if we just have a look at a quick chart on what's exactly happening there. The forecast is that Europe and America, Western Europe will go down about 6%, America a little lower, and interestingly, China up 1%, and India, they say, will be positive 2%. So would you agree, or would you say that India being positive is a great feeling and that we have little room, a little cushion, or is that being too optimistic and we have to be prepared for the worst? How do you look at these figures?
Well, whether it goes somewhat negative, I think a lot depends on the measures we take and the extent of the lockdown we have to impose. But I would think that entering positive territory is on the optimistic side.
So overall, once the bulk of the battle against the virus is over and the economy has to be kick-started again and rebooted, are you seeing what they call a V-shape, like a huge sharp increase and everything coming, the recovery, the entertainment industry, etc.? People are saying that, they haven't watched movies for a long time. Once you're allowed, the lockdown is over and you will rush to movie halls, will be packed. Or they will go to restaurants. They haven't been shopping for a while. They need retail therapy. So are you talking about a V-shaped curve or a U-shaped, much more gradual, longer-term upturn in the economy? There will be an upturn, but how long will that upturn turn? People rushing to a cinema hall or a restaurant or a mall, they have to get rid of fear. They have to get rid of fear that they are not going to be infected sitting next to other people. How long will that fear go, and will that affect the economy upturn as well?
Well, that's precisely the point, right? That being cooped up in our houses now, we feel that as soon as it's lifted, we're going to do all the things that are prohibited at this point. But of course, it's going to be really hard, because what you need for a full resumption of activity is either a clean and quick test, so that everybody can be flagged as soon as they get in to, say, a crowded sports arena, and that they are virus free, or you need fairly intrusive tracking. Yes, they take the virus test at some point, and then they're tracked, and it has to be a recent test because we know there are asymptomatic carriers. We track them. We track anybody they've been near to. This is something that China is doing. And then you flash your app as you enter the restaurant or you enter the stadium, and it says green if you're okay, red if you should be in quarantine or have been anywhere near somebody who has the virus. So that kind of intrusive tracking and the capabilities that go with it, I'm not sure many countries have, including, of course, India. Or third, you have a cure. A cure which says, our death rate is down from anywhere from 10% to 1%, which is the range you see across countries, that it goes down to 0.1%. It's just like a regular flu. If we can bring the death rate down and minimize the horrible scenes of people in ventilators in hospital and the numerous bodies that emerge, then possibly people will become bolder and go into those restaurants and sports arenas. Otherwise, I think what you're going to see is a staggered recovery. First, the firms that can distance their workers, both in coming to work, going home, as well as at the workplace. And then eventually areas that need far more social contact. And presumably that will not really take up until one of these things or a vaccine is widely available.
So, Professor Rajan, you seem to be saying that it's going to take a little longer, or a U shape or a flatter recovery than a sharp V curve. That, in fact, you're maybe even suggesting that until we have certain breakthroughs in medicine and science, that people might not even be allowed to crowd immediately after even 1 or 2 months. So a slow recovery, but not a V-shaped huge upturn immediately, right?
It will vary industry by industry. So you can imagine, for example, if the auto industry can reform the workplace somewhat, it could get a lot of people back to work and produce cars. Now, the question is, do people want more cars now that they know that going in public transport runs the risk of infection? Or do they want, has their attitude towards life changed as a result and they want to consume less? We don't know. A lot may change as a result of this. One of the interesting things is looking at my own industry, which is teaching, right? And in the span of a few weeks, we've converted from full classroom presence and case-based courses, for example, in the business school, to entirely remote presence. And those same cases are being conducted on the web. A lot of us have ramped up our knowledge of technology, of Zoom, of all the fancy devices one can use. So it is possible for industries to change their work practices. I'm sure that many restaurants, for example, will focus more on takeout, but also on quick in and out. How do I get people what they want with appropriate social distancing and get them out rather than have them have to sit in a crowded place? So practices will change also. We have to see how they change.
So you're becoming a bit of a techie now. You're doing all your just a personal question of your life today. Are you doing all your classes by Zoom or WebEx or Skype? And how does it feel like? How is life changing? And main thing, is everything fine? Are you being safe and your family being extra careful?
Well, it's 85%. I don't want to say it's 100%, partly because I want to maintain my job. If everything could be done on the net, it would be too easy. But really, human interaction is very important. So my kids are taking their classes on the web, and they feel a little shortchanged. They feel it's not quite the right experience, and that actually is an important point. I wrote a book on the community. But increasingly, what we find is how important it is in our lives. And it's sort of when you miss it, when we are forced to move away from it, we find the virtual community substitutes a little, but it's a little artificial also, these Zoom parties for those who are connected. It's not quite the same as an actual party.
Oh, so you're missing your partying in Harvard. I see. Okay, that's a important point, but you're doing Zoom parties as well. But given that this is a very serious crisis and the economy is going to get into deep recession around the world and maybe even in India, people say India should go a little stronger with its stimulus, push a little more, spend a lot more money, spend money like the US did of up to 10%. In fact, let's have a look at how different countries have spent money in the fiscal stimulus package so far. We looked at India has really done about 0.8 to 1%, say 1%. Italy spent about, let's see, just about 3.5%. Germany, which is doing very well, spent about 8-9%. America has spent, this is percent of GDP spent on the fiscal stimulus in these different countries. America 10% and Malaysia 16%. Now India 1%, Malaysia 16%. Obviously those are two extremes. If we went stronger, pushed more, had a bigger budget deficit, baad mein dekha jayega about the budget deficit, let's save lives first. We'll look at the positives later, but first of all, just can you tell us what are the dangers when you look at the dark side? What should we be worried about by an excessive push in the fiscal and the stimulus?
That's a great question because we entered this crisis in a very different situation from the West. One of the things that's going on for the West right now that's benefiting them is the fact that the financial sector has largely recovered, with exceptions. Italy is not that strong, but most banks are much better capitalized than they were before the global financial crisis. And corporations, they have taken on some more leverage since then. But what you see is, despite this, they're doing their level best to fuel money into markets. Today, the Federal Reserve announced that it would buy even junk bonds, or effectively support companies that had been downgraded to junk. So I think that there are significantly more resources in industrial countries. And at this point, when everybody is fleeing to safety, the natural home they look for is the bonds of these industrial countries, not necessarily Italy, but the U.S. Treasuries are doing pretty well. Lots of people want to hold them. Unfortunately, emerging markets aren't in the same position. Many of them have large fiscal deficits, India included. They start from a position where there was little fiscal space to begin with, given how sort of we haven't really had significant fiscal discipline over the last few years, especially with a deteriorating pace of growth. Which means we have very, very tight constraints on what we can spend. Of course, there is a crowd which says, let's mimic the West, let's monetize the fiscal deficit, let us spend all that we can. But we have to remember that markets are not as open to us as they are to the industrial West. And if markets don't have a sense that we will be moderately disciplined, if not now, at least in the medium term, then we could have the opposite effect, actually constrain our access to resources even more. And as a result, be in deeper trouble because we have not just a coronavirus problem as well as a real economic slowdown. We also have a financing problem and a financial sector meltdown.
Yeah, as you say, that our budget or fiscal deficit is considered to be very high right now, if you take center plus states together. And our growth rate has been dropping. It's been a big worry. In that scenario, you're saying that basically spending is not a luxury that India has. What would happen? Again, let's stick on the dark side, because then we'll come to what we should do in just a minute. All of us need to know, if we started spending 10% or even 7 or 8% or even 5% of GDP as a fiscal stimulus, what would happen to our economy, to our exchange rate? What would happen to our global ratings? Would they be downgraded? Would there be a loss in investor confidence, etc., etc.? What are the changes one should be aware of, all of us be aware of and cautious about, while still wanting to push and get the economy going?
Well, let's put it this way. I think what this calls for is not, abandoning spending at all. The idea that the West has that of keeping the economy in a kind of induced coma, so that you can wake it up once you've fought the virus, and the economy is by and large still reasonably healthy and can take up at that point, can grow again. That idea makes sense. But that means we have to prioritize and not do some of the wasteful spending that we see in other countries. So what are the priorities? First, people. We have to help poor people.
Right.
Sorry.
So I just wanted to, we're just going to come to what we should do. But the last section, because I think everybody who's saying push, push, push needs to hear this from you. Before you get into how we should help the poorest, could you tell everyone in emerging markets, not just India, what are the downsides that everybody right now should be aware of? And if you're aware of it, you can defeat it or avoid it.
Okay, let's go there. So, what are the worst case scenarios generally for emerging markets, countries like Brazil, South Africa, India? Well, South Africa just experienced a downgrade because from investment grade to below investment grade. Now, what happens when that happens is a bunch of investors who could hold investment grade bonds no longer can hold them and have to sell them. So that creates a need for investors to replace them. Those investors want higher rates. So downgrades typically mean that you have a smaller market for your bonds and that interest rates move up. Now, that's precisely the opposite direction in which you want flows to occur. You want more flows and cheaper flows coming into your economy to help you address the crisis rather than fewer flows and costlier flows. Also, you want to reduce interest rates because you want firms to do better if government bond rates are going up, if rates for corporations are going up because people don't trust your economy, don't trust your currency. That's the other place where pressures could emerge. Now, different countries are at different points in this situation. For example, India's running will probably run a current account, mild current account surplus this year, probably close to zero. That's a good thing. We're not dependent on additional foreign money at this point. But there is a lot of foreign money invested in India, in our corporate sector, in stocks, in government bonds. And if that money starts taking fright, that, you're spending a huge amount, you're going to inflate the currency, you're going to not have the capacity to repay because your debt to GDP is blowing out, and you have absolutely no credibility when you say, trust me, because you've never really brought your fiscal back under control after the global financial crisis. If that's the kind of takeaway that investors have, it could lead to money leaving the country. In emerging markets, we've already seen 100 billion leave in a very short period of time. And if that money leaves, that could be quite sizable and impinge on our reserves, impinge on the trust that we have with international investors. So we have to be a little careful that while we do what is necessary, it is something that is consistent with the views of investors that this is in the interest of the country.
Very, very important to be aware of what people think, whether you're being prudent, whether you're getting back on track, or whether you're just going wild again. But in this sort of dark situation, there are some positives, as you're mentioning, that India has $470 billion worth of foreign exchange. That's a huge asset that we have. But given that, and given other positives, given what could happen to our exchange rate? Should we be worried about our exchange rate, rupee versus dollar?
Well, I mean, the first sign in India often of difficulties is the exchange rate falls. Now, this so far, relative to other emerging markets, our exchange rate has been quite stable, presumably with some support from the Reserve Bank of India. Relatively stable, I should say. We have depreciated some against the dollar, but countries like Brazil have gone down 25%. So we haven't been in that situation. The fact we are not a commodity exporting country, especially of oil, but are an importing country, also helps us in this regard. So our current account deficit is actually going to be helped by the low price of oil. That said, I think we have to be careful that whatever we do, we explain carefully and explain we're not throwing fiscal discipline out of the window. We are going back to reasonable fiscal numbers, because you simply can't spend 12, 13, 14% of GDP, which with any sizable fiscal stimulus we will have to spend this year, without people starting to wonder what the end game is.
Yeah, exactly. End game is crucial. Now, looking at this, taking on from what you're saying, looking at it globally and the global impact on India, I remember you were the first one, not only me, everybody remembers, to forecast the last time in 2008, 2009, when there was that huge financial crisis and everybody said, no, he's wrong, but it turned out to be spot on. This time, are you forecasting there could be some bank collapses in America? And there are one or two banks that everybody's worried about. And if they collapse there, could there be repercussions through emerging markets as well? And will non-performing assets, NPAs, that debts that cannot be repaid to banks, will they go up in India? And will there be a default in retail loans? Just looking ahead at what one should worry about.
Well, I think there are lots of possibilities of bad things happening. Some possibilities of the dire predictions not coming out and us doing better. The concerns in India have to be that we have a fragile financial sector to begin with, which is not the case, for example, in the United States. Banks are really well capitalized, had low levels of NPA. So in the US, the concern will be, yes, if this crisis lasts for a longer time, if there's a second wave of shutdowns, if households basically start defaulting on their mortgages, on their car loans, that would feed into non-performing assets. And of course, corporate defaults would also pick up. So a lot depends on the duration there. In India, it's a little different because we already start with a fairly fragile corporate sector as well as financial sector because of the slow growth of the last few years. The additional worry is this time around retail loans, which have been where the banks have lent a lot because they've shied away from corporations. That if people start losing jobs, if companies start reducing their workforces, that may not be as robust this time around, and you could see many more retail defaults.
This is such a cataclysmic shock to the system. It's clear that from what you're saying, there's going to be a lot of rethinking going on as well. And I mean, and what people should do after this, and what happens if there's another pandemic or epidemic. Should they be more prepared? I've heard, and I don't know how correct it is, that it's difficult to do online banking in America, as banks in America rely so much on call centers in India. And our call centers are just not functioning right now for obvious reasons, the lockdown. So when you go to a screen and look up for try to do something, you find you kind of delays because there's no backup from India, etc. Would the fallout of that, the rethink, and this is one example, but others like that, would there be any pressure internally on America to move call centers back to America because they can't rely on functioning during a crisis like this, and they may do a complete rethink, and that could be a worry for us?
I think this is it is a great question to wonder about the nature of our lockdowns and whether how it works. I mean, one of the concerns is that an abrupt lockdown allows businesses very little time to inform their partners across the world. For example, our call centers, as you point out, are intimately linked to business activity in the US and elsewhere. So when a US bank finds the call center in India no longer is operational, basically it has to slow down business. And this is a time when, with all these applications for loans, both from the retail side as well as the wholesale side, having people man those centers is important. So if you've shut down those centers at this point, they're going to remember, we did not get access to important parts of our supply chain, in this case, the service supply chain. And as a result, we're going to substitute not with somebody from India the next time around, but we're going to replace them with people in Oklahoma or Tennessee. And so there will be a lot of reshoring as a result because of the worry about the credibility of some of these supply chains. So it's really important we think about all the consequences of shutting down, including obviously the most important one, which is public health. but we also try and find ways that some of these entities which are part of global supply chains can in fact operate during such times.
Professor Rajan, I think it's so clear. You made it very clear what the dangers are, but also there seems to be in your narrative some hope that you can avoid those by doing the right thing. So let's just move on to what India should be doing. What specific steps? For example, what should one be doing for the poorest and the non-salaried workers, the daily wagers, who are now in deep, deep trouble? I mean, it's a crisis like a famine.
So I think on the individual side, the household side, it is obvious that in terms of need, the poorest, the jobless, the elderly, as well as the people who don't have salaried jobs and or who have really very, very modest livings, they are the ones we have to help during this time to keep body and soul together, to be able to survive. And I think the government has announced a package. The question is that enough to keep people, in reasonably good health and with reasonably good access to food and shelter? And some commentators, and being some distance from there, it's hard for me to parse the details, suggest it's not enough. If it's not enough, we need to work harder at it. For example, increasing Manrega wages may not be that useful if there is no Manrega work available. So how do we deal with some of those? And it may make sense to try and work on multiple fronts, whereas the government seems to be doing, increase the size of direct cash transfers to the well-defined poor. Yeah, direct cash transfers, but also enhance allocations of food through the public distribution system to those who have, below poverty line cards and so on. But also try and work through NGOs who have more direct contact with some of these poor people. I know an NGO like Pratham seems to be doing a fair amount. And so find some of the NGOs who have more direct contact and work through them to ensure. My niece is calling around to all the parents in her school, asking if any of them is, she works in a government school, asking if any of them has a shortage of basic necessities. This is in Delhi. But I think more such efforts will unearth those who are being missed by the broader schemes, and we have to have resources to tackle that. So that seems like after the efforts on combating the virus, that seems the most important priority. Make sure people have enough to eat and live.
You know, that's actually so important. I mean, you are a banker and therefore conservative and prudent, but you're still saying that what the government has done in terms of direct benefits to the poorest, really not enough. There should be more. You're saying they should be paid a weekly wage, they should be given more food, and that's crucial. In addition to just wages, they also, many have small little businesses, 2-3 people, and they have debts to pay. Do you think as a banker something should be done for them, especially their debt payments? I'm talking about just the poor and the lower middle class right now.
Well, I think the broader point is at least while they're in trouble, they have to be helped with cash flows. Now, you have to be careful because one man's debt payment is another man's income. And the assumption is the person they owe money to is richer and more fortified than that they are. And that may be true. but you have to be careful as you, propose moratoria, propose bans on evictions during this time, etc. That in fact it is going from the stronger to the weaker. But some ways in cushioning the blow over this time on all these other payments also makes sense, because there's no point giving them cash transfers if it goes directly to all their other payments, leaving them little to eat. But that said, I think it's also very important to recognize that in a poor country, you cannot remedy poverty during this crisis. Or put differently, the aim should be survival. The aim should be to help people through the crisis. But it cannot be to say, oh, this is terrible, this is a crisis, I'm going to compensate you for losses. So we'll have a lot of firms saying, I got hit by this crisis, it's no fault of mine, now compensate me. Now, everyone is hit by the crisis, including the taxpayer. The taxpayer cannot compensate everybody just because they got hit. What makes sense for sensible policy is make sure the destruction is not immense, that both people as well as viable corporations survive, but don't compensate them for their losses, because once we start that, who's going to compensate whom? We're all at a loss as a result of this crisis.
That's absolutely true, and you have to be careful, of course. But for small and medium-sized businesses and industries, they really are in terrible shape. Can, for example, the Small Industry Development Bank of India, SIDBI, help them in any way now at this time? I mean, it was set up for crises as well. Or can the government or the RBI step in to take some of the losses in at least the incremental bank loans which are needed to get a small industry just back on track?
Well, so one way emerging markets differ from developed countries is we've got a much larger small and medium enterprise sector, much of it informal. And as you know, this sector has been hit multiple times over the last few years. And as a result, is in a very weak state. Now, that also creates a problem, because some of these entities are, probably unviable, given, what has happened over the last few years. Also, some of them have huge debts, and giving them a little bit is not going to help, especially if it goes out of the door to pay the previous creditors. It just helps the creditors as opposed to help the firm. So one has to be a little careful because you can't remedy the sins of the past through a budgetary allocation now. You're not going to make the unhealthy amongst these healthy. What you can do is keep the healthy from turning unhealthy, so that the entities that have the capacity to maintain their workers, that have the capacity to produce once again, once the restart happens, those entities should get adequate funding. And of course, if the banks are scared of lending at this point, we have to find innovative ways of doing it. Probably more guarantees from entities like the Small Industry Bank in India, SIDBI, but also potentially direct guarantees from the government for first losses. I proposed this in an article I wrote recently for those firms that are that paid taxes last year, in whom effectively the government has some equity, because it may get further taxes down the line if it keeps them alive. So lending to those may make sense. But I think you have to do it in as careful but clever a way as possible, so as to reach people money when they need it. You can't be bureaucratic about this process, but you also have to be a little careful about how you do it, because the potential for fraud and malfeasance is also significant. So, for example, some people suggest the RBI should lend directly to small and medium enterprises. The RBI has no capacity to lend. Its officers don't know how to make commercial loans, because that's not been their job. They know how to see whether a commercial loan has gone bad or not. But asking them to lend directly is really asking for a lot of trouble. So I would say work through the banking sector, work through the NBFCs, the viable, strong ones, work through the insurance companies, try and infuse, and work through large corporations, including public sector corporations.
Right. Actually, that's a good point. Just moving on to the large companies, they employ lots of labor. They have a lot of supply chains. They are crucial aspect of our economy. Now, if they go under, that has a huge impact as well. Unlike small and medium companies, a large company going under will have a bigger impact, of course. Now, should there be two different strategies? You get an excellent strategy for small and medium and SIDBI getting involved, and maybe the government taking on some of the incremental loss with loans. Should there be a different strategy for large companies?
Well, yes, part of a related strategy. I would emphasize that in emerging markets, if you want to save on resources, you have to look at first the viable parts of the corporate sector to help, and the most viable, will be the large companies that are well established, that employ a lot of workers, and we have to make sure that none of them go under in this period to the extent that it can be done with modest resources. So, for example, some of them are finding it difficult to raise funds in the corporate debt market, and some of them find that bankers don't want to lend more. So perhaps a attempt to prop up the market for corporate bonds, that is something the RBI could help in. For example, by lending to financial institutions like insurance companies, well-managed NBFCs, as well as the banks, and encouraging them to use those loans to invest in corporate bonds so that large firms have a new source of access to funds. And the nice thing about that is large firms are often part of large supply chains where they have a lot of small firms supplying to them. Think of Maruti, for example. And if Maruti infuses more funds into its small suppliers, and it has an incentive to do that to keep its supply chain alive and well, then that's a way of infusing funds to small producers, something that banks may find great difficulty in doing. So we need to activate every channel through which liquidity can go through entities that have a way of pushing it further into the small and medium sector. So using the large sector, including firms, but also financial firms, to push liquidity into the small sector may be the way to go at this point. And the Reserve Bank can be a way of pushing that liquidity into those sectors.
So what you seem to be saying is that the Reserve Bank of India, the lender of last resort in our country, has got a very important role to play over the next few months, maybe a year, even more. Does that mean that the Reserve Bank of India has to change its way of functioning a little bit, try new methods to take on this crisis, and to think out of the box, and to, of course, stay prudent, but experiment with new ideas? What should the RBI be doing along with the banks and, as you said, insurance companies and NBFCs?
What I'm advocating is two things. One, that the RBI open the window wider for the kind of collateral it will accept, including, for example, investment-grade corporate bonds. That will allow them to refinance many of these banks against some of the assets that they have, which earlier they could not borrow against from the RBI. So that could pump more liquidity into our existing banks. But the second thing I'm suggesting is that they also lend to entities they normally don't lend to, such as well-managed NBFCs, as well as insurance companies, and see if those entities cannot expand their assets by buying more corporate bonds. That will push more liquidity into the system. And of course, NBFCs can make direct loans also, as they've been doing. Again, it does imply that the RBI will be doing something different, something new. It has to manage the credit risk, for example, by taking haircuts in the portfolios that it accepts as collateral. But it is doable, and it is something that would infuse more liquidity into the system, which it desperately needs at this point.
You know, that's amazing that you're saying that, because it is a new way of thinking for the RBI. A lot of companies will need cash. They will be trying to raise corporate bonds. Anything can be done to make sure that the corporate bond market is propped up and that the bonds actually are successful, any issuance of bonds by corporations?
Again, I would say a little easier to do it through intermediaries who've always been investing in corporations. It gives one level of separation, but also brings their expertise. You don't want the RBI to try and ascertain whether the credit risk of this entity is high or low. Broadly, it can ascertain the credit risk of a portfolio based on ratings. And because the portfolio is diversified, it doesn't require immense new knowledge. But I would say let's use the existing structures. Let's push on the insurance companies to invest more in these areas and give them the funding to do that. And if they can buy at depressed prices, they can also make a fair amount of profit. Let's use their profit motive to push more funding into the necessary areas.
Right. One more thing, like the good news about our foreign exchange reserves, our stock of food grains. One more thing is the RBI's equity, the 8 to 9 lakh crores worth of equity, which is a huge asset for the government. It's lying there. What can be done about that? How can we use that to let the world know we are not in a crisis, we are not in a bankrupt nation. The government has liabilities, but it also has an asset of 8 to 9 lakh crores, which is enormous.
The RBI's equity has been a matter of constant debate over time. And when I was governor and there was a lot of talk about paying it in one big sort of wave to the government, I said, look, you own this. You own the RBI. The RBI is a wholly owned subsidiary of the government. This is an asset of the government. And all you have to do is do the accounting, show that you have an asset which is worth 8 or 9 lakh crores that offsets some of your liabilities. You don't actually need it to be paid because it's very hard for the RBI to pay it out. But more important, I was saying that you need at least one entity in this country which is AAA rated, which in times of trouble can raise the financing that the country needs and can serve as a viable entity which investors will trust. And for that, it needs to be well capitalized. So that was my second argument for trying to ensure the RBI was capitalized at a AAA rated entity. And fortunately, that asset can serve as a source of strength as the RBI expands its balance sheet and essentially serves as an intermediary between the ordinary depositor and the rest of the economy when credit risk concerns have gone up hugely. So that kind of equity has to be sort of the basis for which or behind which the RBI now can step up and fill the gaps left by the financial system. The whole idea was not so much we want this because we feel good about it, but we want this because then we can use it in bad times to offset the fact that our financial sector at those times and our government at those times will be much less well capitalized, much less well able to raise money in the market. The RBI can put its balance sheet to work. And that's exactly what I'm advocating now. The RBI should put its balance sheet to work in intermediating between the public markets, the public investor, and the kinds of firms that need money today. And these are ways it can do it, despite not having the direct expertise.
I think that's a huge point you've just made. The fact that the RBI still has that 8 to 9 lakh crores with it and what you fought for. And this is the time when we look back at your wisdom and say, my gosh, we really love having that 8 to 9 lakh crores now, and we can show the world that we still have a lot of assets and not just liabilities. And in addition to that, what about our foreign exchange reserve, which we mentioned earlier? $470 billion. That's a huge plus point compared to a few decades ago, that the condition that India was in. That makes us feel strong as well. And it has an impact, again, as you say, on investors and market mentality, right?
So that's another thing we focused on very much, which was building our foreign exchange reserves in bad times. Of course, we also didn't want the rupee to appreciate too much when we were the toast of the town and money was flowing in. So we in the I keep saying we. I still feel a proprietary tone towards the RBI, but the RBI has done a great job in building up reserves, again, for the rainy days. So we saw $14-15 billion leave, but that wasn't a huge problem because we have a substantial level of reserves. Today, nobody's looking at us from an external debt viability perspective. They're not seeing us as a frail country, and that's because of what we've done since then. In fact, I would presume the RBI is now engaged with the Fed in these swap transactions, which will make dollar liquidity more available without us having to sell down some of the treasuries. Of course, this is in the Fed's interest because it doesn't want the treasury market also weakening because emerging markets are selling their treasury holdings. But I think the fact that we can do these swap transactions also reflects the strength of our credit rating.
Right. Yeah, going on to another issue, which is not quite in the same vein as the foreign exchange reserves, which are very, very reassuring at the moment and very important. But we also have something physical. We have 80 million tons of food grains stocked. And what are they stocked for? Just like foreign exchange, for a rainy day. And this, if this isn't a rainy day, if this isn't a storm, what is it? Shouldn't we use those 80 million tons of food grain and make sure there's nobody in India dies of starvation? It's just criminal to have those stocks lying around.
That's a great point. FCI is sitting on immense amounts of food grain stocks, and it costs us to store them and to pay for them. And so this is a good occasion to use them. Of course, governments are often reluctant to use these stocks because they'll have to account for it as spending, etc. But it's not using it at this time is really penny wise and pound foolish. You have a lower deficit, but you have a larger deficit in the longer run because not only do you have to store this stuff, a lot of it degrades, and eventually you can't use it. But you've essentially spent much more money doing that. So from a short-term perspective, you don't want the short term to be the enemy of the long term. Use the food grains now, especially for poorer and needy
exactly.
households.
I mean,
and that leads to
you just mentioned that.
Go on.
That you just mentioned that governments are reluctant because it affects their accounting and it affects this. But how can you look a poor person in the eye who's starving and say, I can't give you all these food grains in the go down behind me because of my accounting problems? There are 80 million tons. If not now, when can you give it? This is what it was for. And a harvest coming up.
Yeah, no, we build reserves for a purpose. But I would say again that we need to prioritize in the short run and establish credibility over the medium term that we will return to normal. When I say be mindful of the fiscal, I'm not saying don't spend. We have to spend, especially when it's a matter of life and death on medicines or testing or on food or shelter for the poor and needy people. So we need to spend there. And then once we've done that, and once we've done enough to keep our economy surviving through this, so help the large and medium and small firms that are viable spend, to ensure that they survive. It's only after that that we need to start saying, okay, now that we've decided this is how much we can spend, Where is it going to come from? And how are we going to convince markets that over the medium term, we will return to financial stability? Now, that means a lot of work has to be done also on reassuring the market. So you can't just spend and say, treat us like the United States. The markets simply won't do that. But you can spend and say, this is absolutely necessary, both from a humanitarian point of view, as well as from a long-term survival point of view. But now that I spend what is necessary, let me try and find out how I'm going to change over the medium term and what unnecessary expenditures I can cut. Now, some of it may be symbolic, foreign trips by government officials, but some of it may be real, certain kinds of investments which we've made over a long time with very little return.
I think, Professor Rajan, that actually you concluded and summarized the last hour beautifully. It's been an absolutely brilliant analysis. Strong where you have to be and careful where you have to be. I think I've learned more in this 1 hour listening to you than reading pothas and pothas on the net. Thank you very much. But you did say one thing in one of your articles, that what India needs right now is professional expertise in this area. We need it now. Now, if you were asked to come back, would you accept coming back to India to help out and let bygones be bygones?
I think this is a time of emergence. First, there's no bygones to be bygones. I'm an Indian citizen, and I'm very, very closely engaged in seeing what's happening to India and worry about it every day. So, any Indian citizen, when called upon, will do what is necessary in a time of need. So, I don't think that's an issue. The real issue is whether we recognize how serious this issue is, but also how this any sort of resolution needs to be enmeshed with the medium and long term. That we weren't in a great place to begin with, and how do we reassure both our citizens as well as the foreign investors, as well as domestic investors, that after we deal with the virus, we don't go back to status quo ante, but we move forward in a way that we reach a better place. And that really is what is needed in the country today.
I'm going to be a bit unfair and press you a little more on that. What a lot of people are saying, what is really needed, and many, many people are talking about it, is that India needs Raghuram Rajan back in our country. And from what your answer says, that all Indians will accept and come back, can I take it that you would come back if asked to help India in this crisis?
Well, I think the answer is pretty straightforward, yes.
Yes, great. That's wonderful to hear. It's lovely. Let us just put that in a graphic. If we can quickly type that in. Yes is the answer. After that brilliant analysis, we really would look forward to your expertise in India. Thank you very much for joining us. We learned a lot. So there it is. The answers are straightforward yes, if Raghuram Rajan is allowed. Thank you very much once again. God bless you.